The last generation of American kids spent entire afternoons completely on their own and loved every minute of it. In the 1980s, nobody thought twice about it because that was simply what being a kid looked like. Across almost every town in the country, no matter what state you lived in or what kind of neighborhood you grew up in, the rules sounded the same. Be home before dark, or be home when the streetlights came on. And that was the entire instruction, with no itinerary, no check-ins throughout the day, and often no real way for a parent to reach you, even if they wanted to. By the early 1980s, an estimated 3 million American kids between 6 and 13 came home from school to an empty house every single day, let themselves in, made a snack, turned on the television, and had the place to themselves for a couple of hours before a parent got home from work. Researchers studied these kids closely, and what they found surprised almost everyone. Kids left alone after school showed no consistent signs of harm, and many grew up more independent and more capable than kids who were watched every minute of the day. Outside, the freedom only grew bigger. Front lawns across the country sat scattered with bikes, left exactly where they had been dropped and never locked because locking them never occurred to anyone in the first place. There were no helmets, no tracking, and no parent trailing behind. Just a kid riding to a friend's house, swinging by the convenience store for candy, or disappearing into the woods behind the subdivision. Nobody back home knew exactly where they were until they came rolling through the door around dinner time, sometimes a little dirtier than when they left. For a few hours every afternoon, the neighborhood belonged entirely to the kids who lived in it, and that wasn't a special occasion or a reward for good behavior. It was simply an ordinary Tuesday, the way every day worked. A trip to the corner store counted as its own small adventure. Walking into a 7-Eleven with whatever change sat in your pocket, picking out candy or a soda, and walking back out without a single adult knowing you had been there. That was just part of the rhythm of the day, and multiplying it by every kid on the block, all moving independently across the same streets, paints a picture of a neighborhood that ran itself in its own quiet way. Even primetime television treated all of this as perfectly normal, and some of the most watched shows of the decade casually showed kids riding in the back seat of the family car with no seatbelts on, simply because in millions of American living rooms, that was exactly what was happening. Nobody watching at home thought it was worth a second glance. Looking back now, there is something almost funny about how unremarkable all of this felt at the time, when a kid could vanish for hours, covering half the neighborhood on two wheels, and the only thing waiting at home was dinner and maybe a question about where they had been asked, more out of curiosity than concern. This wasn't a childhood built around supervision, it was a childhood built around trust, and most of the time, that trust turned out to be right. That easy, unscheduled version of childhood did not fade away gradually. It changed almost overnight because of a handful of stories the entire country watched unfold at the same time. On May 25th, 1979, a 6-year-old named Eton Patz walked 2 blocks to his school bus stop in Manhattan alone for the first time, and he never arrived and was never found. His disappearance sparked a national movement around missing children, and the date later became National Missing Children's Day, declared by President Reagan in 1983. 2 years later, in July of 1981, a 6-year-old named Adam Walsh was abducted from a Sears store in Florida, and his father, John Walsh, channeled his grief into advocacy. In 1984, he founded the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, an organization still operating today, and the story became an NBC movie in 1983, watched by an enormous number of American families. Around the same time, the Atlanta child murders were unfolding, with roughly 24 victims between 1979 and 1981, and to families watching the news every night, it felt like it was happening everywhere at once. In 1982, Congress passed the Missing Children's Act, allowing missing children's information to be entered into a national database for the first time. Then, starting in December of 1984, the faces of missing children began appearing on milk cartons in kitchens across the country, a campaign that continued into the 1990s. For the first time, an entire generation of parents had a reason to glance twice before letting their kids out the door. Here is the part of the story that puts everything in a different light, and it changes how you look back at all of it. By the mid-1980s, the number repeated constantly in the media was 50,000 children abducted by strangers every year, and it showed up in news segments, school assemblies, and public service announcements treated as settled fact. That number did not hold up. By 1985, researchers and journalists were already questioning where it came from, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the same organization founded after the Adam Walsh case, eventually revised its own estimate down to somewhere between 4,000 and 20,000 a year. A federal study in 1990 went further, finding that the number of cases involving a stranger actually taking and holding a child came out to just over 100 a year nationwide, with about 92% of those kids coming home safe. The fear was real, and the risk it was responding to was always much smaller than it felt. Here's the thing though, the response to that fear changed childhood anyway, and the change can be measured. In England in 1971, 86% of primary school kids were allowed to walk home from school entirely on their own, and by 2010, that number had dropped to 25%. Same age group, same walk home, just 2 generations apart. The 1980s wasn't just the last decade of a certain kind of childhood. It was the moment the line started to bend. By the 2000s, some people had started to notice what had quietly disappeared, and one story brought it back into the national conversation. In 2008, a New York writer named Lenore Skenazy let her 9-year-old son ride the subway home alone with a map, a subway card, and some emergency money. And he made it home in under an hour, exactly as planned. When she wrote about it, the reaction was enormous, and she was nicknamed America's Worst Mom on national television. Rather than backing away from it, she leaned in, founding a movement called Free Range Kids, and later a nonprofit called Let Grow, both built around one idea, that kids deserve more independence than most parents allow. In the years that followed, parents in multiple states were investigated and in some cases charged for letting their kids walk to a park or a store alone, the exact kind of afternoon that had been completely unremarkable a generation earlier. In 2018, Utah became the first state in the country to pass what is known as a free-range parenting law, stating that a parent cannot be charged with neglect just because their child, if old enough and mature enough, walks somewhere on their own. A state had to pass a law to protect something that, in the 1980s, simply had a name, and that name was childhood. This is where the story connects to today, and it does it in a way that is worth smiling about rather than worrying over. In his 2024 book, The Anxious Generation, psychologist Jonathan Haidt traces a timeline that lines up with everything in this video, arguing that childhood built on unsupervised time and free play started fading in the 1980s and kept fading through the 1990s, eventually replaced by something new between roughly 2010 and 2015, when smartphones and social media became a constant presence in kids' lives. A 2023 study in the Journal of Pediatrics reached a similar conclusion from a different angle, connecting the long decline in independent play to the rise in youth mental health concerns, serious enough that the United States declared it a national emergency in 2021. Here is the part worth holding on to. Kids today are, by almost every measure, growing up in one of the safest periods in American history, and with around 72 million children under 18 in the country, and roughly 100 stranger abductions a year. The odds of it happening to any individual child come out to about 1 in 720,000. What it really comes down to is this: the freedom that defined the 1980s was never about danger going up or down. It was about something simpler. An entire generation of kids trusted to be out of sight for a few hours, who came home with stories, scraped knees, and nothing to report. That is the part worth remembering fondly, not because the world got worse after that, but because for one bright stretch of American childhood, Being unreachable for an afternoon was something every kid got to feel, and almost nobody worried about it until they had to. Maybe the nicest way to think about it is this: the 1980s weren't a more dangerous decade that somehow worked out fine. They were a decade where an entire country agreed, without ever discussing it, to let kids have a little more room than we tend to give them now. For the kids living through it, that room felt like nothing special at the time, and it only looks remarkable looking back. If you grew up in the 1980s, you were part of that last generation, out the door after breakfast, home when the streetlights came on, with nobody keeping track in between. Tell us in the comments where your bike took you, which corner store was yours, and what your own version of being home before dark looked like. And if you want more of this kind of look back at how American life actually felt, subscribe, because that is exactly what this channel is for.